Welcome to Football and Society, a new podcast exploring societal issues through the lens of the beautiful game. I'm Ash McMullen and I'm joined by Norman Riley and Chris Shipman. And over the next few weeks, we'll be exploring topics including the ethics and future of gambling sponsorship, supporter ownership of clubs, and the hidden effect of what a stadium move means for fans. Today, though, we're looking at the rivalry between England and Scotland. In November 1872, Scotland and England played each other in what is now recognised as the first ever international football fixture. Nearly 150 years later, it remains one of the great rivalries of the footballing world and continues to produce classic encounters on the pitch. Stuart Whigham and Tom Gibbons, in an article published in 2018, explored the rivalry from the perspective of Scottish and English football fans. Although previous research had explored the footballing history of England versus Scotland, very few studies had focused on supporters' perspectives. Wiggum and Gibbons collected their data using two methods. They looked at comments posted by English members of an online fan community, and they also conducted interviews with Scottish fans. The views expressed by supporters indicated that a complex range of emotions and attitudes influences fans' approach to the England-Scotland rivalry. Among English fans, some were particularly antagonistic towards Scotland, while others were keen to highlight that English and Scottish supporters have far more in common than typical media portrayals suggest. The Scottish fans interviewed tended to acknowledge an anti-English sentiment within sport, but gave differing explanations as to what fueled these feelings. The media was perceived to play a key role in shaping attitudes, and some fans criticised media representations for oversimplifying the complex and evolving relationship between English and Scottish fans. The authors suggest that future research could investigate how recent political developments, namely the Scottish independence referendum and Brexit, may have impacted on perceptions of this historic rivalry. It's a pleasure to welcome Stuart Wiggum, one of the authors of the article, onto the Football and Society podcast to discuss this research. Stuart is a senior lecturer in sport, coaching and physical education at Oxford Brookes University. Hello Stuart, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to join you.
Stuart, could we begin by asking, why did you undertake this research and why were you particularly interested in fans' perspectives on England versus Scotland?
This stemmed back to actually about 10 years ago when I was doing my master's studies at Loughborough University, and obviously part of that was to write a thesis. And I thought about this long before, particularly because for my own kind of personal journey, I moved down to England when I was 21 to do postgraduate study, and I worked as a teacher down here, and brought with me a lot of baggage about England and Englishness, and particularly coming to Oxford in the southeast, and this caricature we have about what the southeast represents in comparison to home, which is Edinburgh for me. So when I came to this, and it came from basically, I was down here during the World Cup 2006, and I think it was Sweden and England. I was in a pub watching with all my friends, and I jumped up and celebrated when Henrik Larsson, I think it's Henrik Larsson, scored. And everyone looked at me, and I'd said to them, I will be supporting Sweden. And they kind of looked at me with shock and horror that I was genuinely delighted that Sweden had scored. So I kind of went back and did a bit of navel gazing after getting a bit of a ribbon when England eventually won. And I guess I was interested to know, how does this kind of manifest itself in not a uniform way, and it's not uniform, but how did the kind of the historical, educational, kind of pedagogical things that happen in Scottish society lead to this kind of, I guess, not default position, but this common narrative about England as the other. And how does my own kind of journey in terms of going from Scotland to England, and that often kind of common journey we've made from Scotland down south of the border, play out? And it's interesting talking to people because they all have their own individual narratives and stories about this. So it came from a bit of navel gazing, I think, in many ways. And yeah, I'm still cheering on anyone but England. So it's not changed 15 years later.
And while you're talking about Scottish supporters, you do mention the term "Little Englander,"
Yes.
the mentality on several occasions. Could you give us a breakdown of what that means?
Oh, I mean, and this is the straw man that we build up in some ways. But I think the phrase that was bandied around during Brexit was gammon, and I think that's the kind of idea that springs to mind. The type of person that is drinking your warm pints of mild down the pub, football when it's there, cricket, that kind of idea around it, but also this insular, slightly right wing version of England, which has come back to the fore, I think, in the kind of political parlance in some ways. And I'm vested in the empire, kind of this, as Maguire, as some of you might know, Joe Maguire, a sociologist, talks about willful nostalgia, harking back to better times, talking about 1966, Queen and Country and all that type of thing, which is not a real reflection, but that's a straw man we build up. And it is a kind of southeastern England, little England that we think of. And I've got a couple of Geordies on the line. So Scotland look at the Geordies and Mackhams and Scousers and Manx in a very different light to how we view this little Englander, which is really the kind of rump of the southeast England. So I think that kind of encapsulates, in my mind's eye, how Scots see that little Englander and the kind of bogeyman we create in that sense.
Well, that leads nicely on to the next question about one of your respondents talks about Scottish fans behaving in a way to distance themselves from England. Could it be argued that whilst there is a sense of national pride for Scottish football fans at matches and tournaments, an exaggerated Scottishness can be performed as a means of ensuring they're not perceived as being English or associated with England in any way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fairly insightful comment. I think for your normal Scot, there's a bit of a cringe about the Tartan Army, and I think even for a kind of dedicated Scottish football fan, there's sometimes a bit of a cringe of the antics that you see, where it has become a caricature, and it does kind of come from the 80s, and obviously up until that point, both Scotland and England alike had problems with hooliganism. And Scotland were just as bad, if not worse, in terms of their behaviours. But after Heysel and after the kind of the stigmatisation of the England football fan, Scottish fans went out their way to almost play this caricature of the friendly, daft, drunken idiot in some ways, the happy bam, as we call them in Scotland. And I think in some ways that is a caricature. We do play up to it, and the Tartan Army certainly play up to it as well. But then those types of things then become self-fulfilling prophecies in some ways. And because we've had so little success in a sporting sense, particularly in football, to get excited about, it's about the event of taking part and supporting the team rather than enjoying success on the team. And I think we're sometimes happy when we lose in some ways, like it's kind of part of our MO these ways. But as a lot of the participants talked about, it not always being anti-English, but about being non-English or other than English. And I think that distinctiveness sometimes is, in many ways, the end goal of the way we act.
It's really interesting what you say there, especially about how people carry themselves abroad as
Yeah.
well. I've lived abroad on numerous occasions, so speaking from lived experience, even living in countries where I don't even necessarily speak the language as the first language, going into kind of expat pubs and meeting up with people, there almost is an exaggerated sense of self. You sometimes behave in a way, and I personally reflected and I thought, is this how I actually am? Am I actually behaving in a way that people are expecting me to behave in this particular situation? And I think when you interviewed Scots living in England, a few replies stood out, but one in particular, I think it's this: it's the relationship with England's a part of what defines being Scottish, especially if you live down here. And there's a huge sense of I just don't want to lose to England. It's not so much the winning; it's just not wanting to lose, and it's the same when they play someone else. I don't actually want them to lose. I just don't want them to win. And you've mentioned that your own experiences kind of tie into that thought process. Do you think there's an argument that patriotism and identity are expressed with greater vigour by people outside of where they deem their homeland, i.e. there's an element of performance, let's say Scottish and English fans actively adhering to these stereotypes and caricatures?
I mean, I think so. I think we all play out these kind of these long fought battles and rivalries, and kind of part of it comes banter and a kind of performance of self. So in many ways, it happens every January. Obviously, January, February, when the Six Nations comes on. I expect to go in after Scotland have inevitably normally lost with some type of quip or banter and things like that. Whereas I think, for example, say I was up in Scotland before I moved down here, it wasn't such a regular thing. It wasn't a kind of port of conversation, and I just have to open my mouth and like my accent comes out, and then someone knows that you are Scottish and they expect you to act in a particular way, and we have the jokes about being tight and not getting around at the bar. which is obviously something which I play on a regular basis, and I play on that level. But I think when you come down and you leave home, so to speak, in terms of leaving Scotland, I think your behaviours do start to play up to that a little bit more. And I think why I kind of chose to, just for a bit of context, speak to Scots living in England was there's a lot more of that navel gazing and reflecting upon why we're actually doing what we're doing. And particularly I've got an English partner, my wee boy's English. What am I going to be doing in 10, 15 years' time when he's cheering England scoring? Am I going to be really getting upset or swearing or complaining? Or is it just that I don't want to see... It's the fear. The fear is a big win. The fear is a World Cup win and the relentless droning and all the rest of it. And actually, it's quite enjoyable when England do well and you get the hubbub and the excitement. We just don't want to go all the way to win something because that's where it gets a little bit unbearable.
Yeah. I'll tell you what, it's interesting what you said about how in Scotland there are certain parts of England that aren't necessarily viewed as coming under that little Englander description. And when you mention the kind of the harken back to the 1966 World Cup, it ties in with in my opinion, a form of hyper sort of patriotism and nationalism. It's the kind of two World Wars and one World Cup mentality. And when you see a little England, I think anyone who hears the phrase will have a fair idea immediately of what you're referring to. But what I was interested in was this perception of certain regions in the north of England, as you say, Liverpool, Newcastle, Sunderland, not being viewed in that way. And when I was at school, it was always a thing to choose a Scottish team, obviously going to school in Gateshead in the northeast. And I don't know, do you have any kind of insight or any thoughts on why that might be the case, that relationship that it's Scotland and England, but it's kind of not Scotland and England at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, I think the probably the obvious answer, which won't surprise you, is it goes back to a class thing. It goes back to a class and wealth thing without a shadow of a doubt. And I think if we think back to where the kind of growing sense of Scottishness and a division and a kind of political and economic segregation from England, it goes back to the 80s and the Thatcher era and the whole process of deindustrialisation. And at that sense, Scotland suffered, yes, the poll tax and suffered a lot from the kind of the policies of the Conservative government. But we were mindful enough to know that we weren't alone in that. And we looked at what was happening in the northeast, the northwest, the kind of traditional coal mining, manufacturing parts of England. And you see a sense of solidarity there as well. And the bogeyman again is Westminster, it is London, it is the southeast, where you see, I guess, the economy flourishing, and you hear the voices. It's the voices that you hear and see on your TV, which are the ones that you feel that they're the ones to blame in some ways. So I guess is that sense of kind of solidarity between people going through similar kind of economical, political changes. And I guess, and I know I've said about accent and voice a little bit, but you hear someone's voice and straight away you're like, oh, you'll be all right. Like even you've not talked about going overseas, pick up on an accent and you think, all right, okay, they're from there. I think they'll actually be sound. And it's ridiculous to make those judgments straight away. But these all come from a kernel of truth somewhere in some sense. And then it plays out in those ways. So, yeah, I think that division is possibly start to be lost a little bit between, and I think Scotland has got a much more distinct sense of identity than it did in the past. But I do think there's a false dichotomy of Scotland v England. I think it's Scotland v a version of England, which is possibly that little Englander mentality in some ways.
You mentioned Thatcher and you mentioned obviously the Tartan Army and the cringe that you feel as a Scotland fan, even though your loyalties are the same. I think something that I wanted to ask you about was Rangers in the 80s very memorably welcomed Margaret Thatcher to Ibrox, much to the anger of other fans of other clubs. I just wondered how fair it is for the media historically and currently to paint Scottish support as a singular entity. Is it more complex than that?
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's very much more complex. I mean, one of the things which I guess is important to understand as an outsider is that the Scottish fans and the Scottish national team in some ways represents everything but Celtic and Rangers in some ways. Now, I'm not saying for a second that there's no Celtic and Rangers fans who support England. I think that's changed a lot. But the Tartan Army in many ways is a coalition of lots of smaller clubs. And even as a Hibs fan, I think Hibs fans are into it, Hearts fans are into it to an extent. But quite often it was your kind of more, as we call them in Edinburgh and Glasgow, the provincial teams, the smaller teams from the Fife region, the north, who would really buy into the Tartan Army. Because if you think about, and this goes back to Scottish football, there's not much to get excited about. It's Celtic or Rangers, or there's the Scotland team, because being outside of that, it can be a little bit a little bit problematic. And then obviously with Rangers and Celtic, they've got their own alignments outside of Scottishness in some ways. So you mentioned about Thatcher and her welcome at Ibrox, and broadly speaking, Unionists and Conservative and more right wing and economically and socially conservative people have been more welcome at Ibrox, and it's reflected still in their fan base. Where Celtic, as you probably well know, had alignments with Republican sympathies in Ireland and the kind of old Labour Party, so to speak, in Scotland as well. So you can't say that Scottish fans are this kind of homogenous bunch who capture this kind of sense of oneness in some ways. But even saying that, those who do buy into the Scottish team, because it's easy to opt out of international football now, do kind of buy into kind of this kind of unitary sense of Scottishness. And I think it is slightly better, more coherent, the sense of Scottish identity compared to what we're seeing now in England, because I think there's more kind of division in English identity than there is in Scottishness in some ways.
Absolutely. I'm going to jump in there quickly. It's interesting what you say about the kind of the so-called smaller clubs in Scotland being the clubs who kind of provide the national team's fans. I mean, the reality is, if you look at any England match and you look at the flags that are around the stadium, it does tend to be, teams like, I don't know, Rochdale, your kind of smaller clubs. And I think, as you say, it's because of, it's just that, I guess it's that human craving for some form of success ultimately. But what you were saying there about the Scottish identity being stronger now than perhaps it was, let's say, even 30 years ago. I think, and you're right, I agree entirely that England right now, I think, is a lot more fractured than it was 30 years ago. And Scotland is a lot more, let's say, together than it was, because obviously there's an end game in sight, and you've got the European Union Brexit vote, where there's a clear disparity between people in Scotland and England. So it's interesting how the kind of rivalry on the football pitch, to a certain extent, is really kind of being mirrored by the rivalry politically right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think if one thing's become clearer, when the Labour Party came back in and they were talking, the Blair Labour Party came back, there was that real sense of, I was cool Britannia without a shadow of a doubt, but there's a kind of sense of, like, for Scots, it's all right being part of the UK. I mean, this is not too bad, and we're all getting a good deal here. We can be Scottish, we can kind of have the best of both worlds in some ways. And the Thatcher era was quite quickly forgotten. And I think we can't see the return of that for Scotland in some ways, and I think that's why that division has kind of grown greater, and it's then been kind of manifest itself in lots of different big ways. So even the day after the Scottish independence referendum, and I was up all night watching it and bleary-eyed in the morning, and then Cameron kind of dusts out and with a little kind of smirk smile and outside Downing Street starts talking about English votes for English laws, and you're like, straight away it's gone back to the politics of division. And then Brexit, we've only got a small amount of time to talk about that, but if we're thinking about how clear that division was in terms of what Scotland wanted and now what is happening to it, and then just look at any political map and we see what's happened there, it's been a complete sea change in Scotland in terms of politics, and the old divisions, which kind of splintered Scotland in some ways, have been kind of not completely diminished, but have been kind of merged together in a more kind of coherent sense of Scottishness and what we want and what we don't want. And what we don't want is what is happening in the UK and the rest of the UK at the moment. And there is an end goal in sight for a growing number of Scots. And I think what's interesting there is what's happening with your moderate Scot. You're kind of, not your kind of tartan wearing, flag waving, hot nationalists in some ways. It's the ones who are just being a little bit more kind of pragmatic about, well, look at this is a car crash. We need to do something about this. And even if we take an economic hit, in some ways we've got our responsibility. We don't have to blame England or blame Westminster for things going wrong. So yeah, I think in some ways, as the football rivalry's gone downhill in its importance, the political division has kind of risen, and until there's some kind of resolution, it's going to be here to stay, I think.
Yeah, you were talking about class earlier, and in the article you actually mentioned that there are differences in the intensity of anti-English sentiment between different sports, and that is down to contrasting social classes. Did respondents explicitly refer to class? And if so, did they suggest that the rivalry is more intense within more working class sports?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the questions I actually asked participants directly, because the original research project was not about football. It was about anti-Englishness in sport and society more broadly. But unsurprisingly, all roads led back to football in particular. And I think it does reflect what happens in England in terms of class divides between sports in some ways. But in Scotland, football is the working class sport, and it is the sport that's offered in all of the state schools in many ways. And then rugby union is the big other in terms of club sport and kind of international sport. But that is a middle and upper class sport. And not only is the sport and the kind of institutions small c conservative, but its players and its the parents, the families, and the whole culture is also small c conservative as well. And in many ways, I would always associate rugby as a kind of unionist sport of Scotland, and football is to be the one which is maybe a little bit more likely to be a more nationalist endeavour in some ways, which is, like I said before, I have to caveat that in terms of the simplifications of the divides in the West Coast along kind of Catholic and Protestant lines in terms of football support, which undermines any kind of sense of, well, this is a nationalist sport, because 50%, 60% of the football fans in Scotland associate with Rangers and Celtic more so than they would do Scotland per se. But even just mention it to them, to the fans, they said, well, no, it's football. Football's the issue where it comes here. But then interestingly, in the 90s, around about the times of the Grand Slam, 91 Grand Slam, and in that area, rugby were the first to play Flower of Scotland. They were the ones that kind of blazed that trail in that sense, which was a kind of surprising thing if you think about rugby and that really kind of conservative culture around there. And then a lot of the participants mentioned about the Olympic thing and the kind of British Scottish divide of when you have these unifying events and everyone does get together and support a British team in some ways. But I think even there, that kind of sense of Scottishness is still there. In Scotland, we're still referring them to Scottish athletes. So it does really kind of go back to football. It does really kind of go back to class in some ways, in my mind's eye. And I think football is the sport where it manifests itself. And I guess the more heated rivalries always come from those type of fans, I guess.
It's interesting. You just mentioned the Olympics there, so I guess you're alluding to the fact that I guess the question is, were normal rivalries suspended during this time? But from your perspective, the Olympics were kind of held up, I think, by the let's say the establishment in this country in particular as this kind of unique event where it showed the strength of the union and Britain's place in the world. How did you perceive that? Obviously, from a Scottish perspective, were normal rivalries put to one side, or was it just as I think many people's gut instinct tell them, just an absolute myth? This was a hugely unifying event.
I guess it's a difficult one in some ways because I think a lot of Scottish people do with the Olympics get excited about Team GB, and they do kind of see it not as necessarily unifying, like we're all one and this is going to kind of help us forget everything about it, because as I say, they're all then caveated as this is a Scottish person who's made the Team GB, and we get more excited when a Scots person is going to kind of do well. So Andy Murray, for example, we're over the moon for, but Chris Hoy and all the rest of it, we'll watch them more and we'll will them on more. But equally, we're quite happy when things kind of tally away and the GB medal count goes up, and we do get a sense of that usness within there. But again, going back to the context of football on two different levels. One, the London Olympics, when they had the men's football team in particular, was another kind of antagonistic move to have basically an English team with a couple of Welsh players in there. Because in many ways, that's like, well, that's what would just happen anyway. If we lost the Scottish football team, it would just be England plus, at the moment, Andy Robertson. That is effectively how we view our position. And we're realistic enough to know that that's because we're shit and that's what's going to happen. But that goes back to why sport is this kind of avenue and this area where Scottishness fosters and it flourishes, because we've always had that luxury of being one of the few nations in the world that has a nation without a state has its own team, and it gives you that sense of distinctiveness in some ways. And whilst that is lost at the Olympics in some ways, we still use the kind of I's and the us's to talk about the Scottish athletes, and we use it in a more kind of caveated manner for the British athletes. And we will use the phrase British rather than English to kind of discuss and describe those things there. Whereas in the other sports, your footballs, your rugbies, all the others where we have our own distinct Scottish team, it just reinforces that sense of otherness in some ways. And I certainly didn't cheer on the Team GB men's team at London 2012, but the Team GB women's team, which had Scottish players in it, I was more than happy to will them on. So they might have been suspended, but I think there was a element of window dressing.
You know what? It's interesting because I mean, it's obviously it boils down to a kind of a strong feeling of identity, and even as someone, you know, as a Geordie, when I see another Geordie being successful, it does give me like a great sense of pride. And I look at the England national team now. I'm English, but I don't necessarily have any kind of great love for the England national team. I don't follow the team, but if there's a Newcastle player in there or a Geordie in there, then you do kind of hang your hat on them, and it does give you this sense of I dare to say it, but it does give a sense of pride. And I guess on a micro level, the feeling of seeing a Scottish athlete in Team GB it's kind of a similar feeling to a certain extent, on a very micro level. But I can see where that kind of sentiment would kind of come from, you know.
And I think that's one of the things about, I guess, Scottishness and Welshness and even Irishness in some ways. The identity and the population size is small enough to kind of have that sense of oneness. And I don't get too academic about it, but the kind of Anderson arguments about imagine community. You can imagine
Mm-hmm.
all Scots kind of coming together, kind of supporting your team and your athletes and all those types of things. Whereas England's almost a bit too big to have that homogenous identity in some ways. And the regional identities are stronger, but then they're of a manageable size to actually be able to feel like, okay, this is what it means to be a Geordie. This is what it means to be a Scouser or a Yorkshireman or whatever it might be for
Aye.
that matter. And I think that's why the identities in the kind of the home nations outside of England are that little bit stronger and a little bit more coherent. And there's a big divide in Scotland between the kind of central belt and the kind of highlands and the lowlands, and the identity is a lot more complex than that. But there is that kind of greater ability to kind of draw parallels between and within Scottishness. And I've got a few kind of academic friends who are Scousers, and we talk about the World Cup, and they like, look, we're Scouse first, we're English second, and yes, we're happy if there's some Liverpool players playing, but really deep down, we kind of want to distance ourselves from that. And I even
Mm-hmm.
sense now, given the direction of travel in England, there's a much greater sense of people wanting to go back to their regional identities, to not be grouped with maybe a form of politics that they don't ascribe to in some ways.
You mentioned the women's game a
Absolutely.
minute ago in the
Hmm.
context of the Olympics, and I think it's fair to say that a lot of the focus on the rivalry since the 1880s has very much been on the men's game, given that the women's game was banned actually for quite a while. But as the women's game does grow so dramatically in popularity and support, and England are hosting the Women's Euros in 2021, I just wonder what your sense of how that traditional rivalry is being reflected among supporters of women's football. Do you think the situation is the same in a kind of non-Olympic context, or is there a different sentiment?
Yeah, I think because the fan cultures around women's football are still developing, it's hard to tell. I would say that there's a strong kind of crossover between who supports the women's Scotland team and who supports the men's Scotland team. So I would have loved to have gone to France 2 summers ago to kind of interview and speak to the fans to see what the Scottish fans and the identity around there was, because I don't really have my finger on the pulse with it. But what I do know is, regardless of the sport and regardless of the gender, when you talk to a Scottish player about who's their big rival they want to beat, it's England. And that'll be the same. And when you saw Scotland and England playing each other at the World Cup, you saw that sense of that was the one that mattered the most in some ways to one, the fans, but also the players themselves. And I don't want to say it's like a microcosm, because it's not, because that's kind of hierarchizing the men's game of the women's game. And for Scotland particularly, we should be supporting the women's team more so, because that's by far our more successful representatives in football. I mean, if you want to go and see Scotland a major championship, you follow the women's team, not the men's team. But I think because there's not that kind of status, it's not established itself in terms of the kind of fans' imagination yet. The rivalry's not been quite so intense, but certainly if you think about who's going to be the biggest significant other for the Scotland team, it will always still be England, regardless of it. And even if, like, the Commonwealth Games, Scotland are playing England in hockey, you tune into that. Despite the fact I know nothing about hockey, I had no idea why you'd want to play that game in the first place. That's the one who is the other in some ways, and I think that plays the same across all sports in that sense.
Respondents in your study referred to the media misrepresenting the relationship between Scottish and English fans, and some of the Scottish fans talked about how the English media would exaggerate the chances of the England team, and that would annoy Scottish fans. Which specific media sources did respondents mention? Were they looking at particular newspapers or TV channels?
I mean, I think first and foremost, it's got to be TV. That's the real one that gets under the skin in some ways. So I mean, I'll pivot to the media first. One thing to kind of note about the print media, newspapers is, and I'm sure most of you know this, but we get our own Scottish versions of
course.
the Sun, the Times, all of the kind of London print. So we don't see what you see, and we don't have to, in some ways, when the World Cup's going on, suffer that type of thing. But when it comes to, say, the ITV or the BBC coverage, that's uniform across the country. And one of the ironies at the moment is we get the England games, the England qualifiers on ITV for free, where we have to pay to watch Scotland play via Sky. Yeah. So we get that. Yeah. So you're more likely to be able to watch England play than you are Scotland play for the kind of general punter. But yeah, I think what really gets under our skin in some ways is the hype and the excitement around it. And I think the BBC are a little bit more mindful of the fact that they're a British broadcaster, and that there's also people from outside of not just England, but outside of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland who are tuning in to watch the matches. ITV, on the other hand, I think are a little bit more parochial in their TV, in their coverage of the games. And the hype is, ultimately, they're a commercial body. They've got to get people to tune in, hyped up about the games to kind of get excited. But I think when you have commentators using the phrase "we," and you can hear the tone in the voice getting excited or upset when things are going their way, and not being able to be impartial about what's happening, to talk up the chances of England when up until recently it's unrealistic. You just kind of think, well, look, you're not world class. You're not going to win these games necessarily. You're supposed to commentate and analyze the game. You're not supposed. It's not like Arsenal TV. You know, when you've got like fans coming on and getting excited about their own team. And I understand there's an audience there, but you've got to bear in mind that that's just problematic. The name Clive Tildesley cropped up on more than one occasion unprompted on that basis. And like him or loathe him, and in Scotland it's normally loathe. It's that type of mentality which in some ways kind of gets under the skin. But yeah, I'll leave it there on that point.
Completely understand it. It's interesting you mentioned Scottish versions of newspapers that are based in London. Obviously, you've got the Scottish Mail as well, but I guess you wouldn't anticipate seeing a headline in a Scottish newspaper saying, on the front page of a newspaper, saying Achtung, surrender when England played Germany, such as you saw in 1996. So there you go, tabloid newspapers, classy stuff.
And that's the thing. I mean, the tabloids are the ones that we kind of look at and laugh, but we also understand that they're pitching towards a particular market, and our ones are just as guilty of kind of blowing up the Scotland team as well. But I think if you look at the headlines that will be likely to be coming up in the press tomorrow for the Serbia match or on Friday for the Serbia match, I think they're almost a lot more circumspect as well in terms of what Scotland are and where they are. And we don't have, well, we do have the war narratives. We do get the old Braveheart stuff out when we're playing England, but it's not that kind of bordering on xenophobic stuff, which you see when Germany's on, or Argentina, it's the Falkland Wars. You just kind of think, I mean, come on, let's move on beyond that a little bit now. But as I said, I'll stop myself from making more comments.
No, it would be nice to move on, wouldn't it? Moving on, you observe that self-identification as the underdog sustains Scotland's passion for the rivalry with England. Are rivalries with other home nations consequently lacking in intensity? I guess to what extent do events off the field add to Scottish fans' self-identification as an underdog as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think broadly speaking, there's more of a best of the rest feel amongst when Scotland play Wales, and Northern Ireland's slightly different, but particularly for Wales, we've always kind of saw ourselves as England are the bigger team, and then it's Scotland in football, and then it's Wales, and then Northern Ireland somewhere behind that. And history over the last 20 years has shown that is certainly not the case anymore, and not just because of Wales' success in major tournaments in the last 5-10 years, but also just when we play against each other, we've more often than not lost against them. But I think there's more of a sense of a solidarity there. Like, if there's a Scotland-Wales game going on in Scotland, you would see Scotland and Wales fans mingling in the pubs and having a bit of banter and a bit of crack. And that happens when the English come up for the rugby as well. There is that kind of, it's more of a kind of friendly rivalry sense for the rugby, which you wouldn't have when it comes to the football fans in some ways. So there certainly is, when you compare Scotland's rivalry with like Wales and Northern Ireland, a lack of intensity in that kind of sense, and you don't have that underdog. So in some ways, in Scotland, we hate being favourites. That's the other thing. Like that's really kind of disconcerting for our whole identity of we're actually expected to win. So what do we actually do here? The Northern Ireland one's a little bit more complicated for lots of different reasons, which again we could kind of get into. But obviously for a big chunk of Scotland, there's an affinity with Northern Ireland, and there's affinity with the kind of one geographically and location wise, but also the kind of ethno-religious, political, religious situation there as well. But also there's a lot of animosity between Scotland and Northern Ireland for some Scots as well. So there is probably a little bit more heat to that one there. And you also see that when in European competitions, the Scottish clubs go across Northern Ireland, there is that kind of mini proxy sectarian stuff coming out between not just Celtic and Rangers going across there, but even if Hibs and Hearts go across there and get one of the bigger kind of Catholic or Protestant teams. We've not played Northern Ireland much recently, so I'd be interested to see how that plays out now. There's a kind of stronger Irish identity in some ways, or Northern Irish identity, but definitely doesn't compare to the big Goliath of England in that sense.
In the past, the likes of Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond have really firmly rejected on multiple occasions the idea that and the Scottish independence movement represents nationalist attitudes in that kind of traditional, I guess, right-wing sense. And instead they seem to be kind of pushing that it represents more of a civic and institutional nationalism instead. I just wondered, to what extent do you think that Scottish fans and that Tartan Army embodies that civic and institutional pride as opposed to that, air quotes, traditional right-wing nationalist sentiment?
It's a really interesting question, and I think there's lots of different layers to it. I think I'll go back to one of my other responses about the kind of makeup of who the Tartan Army is in that sense. And because it is, as you said, about the England kind of fans as well, it's often a coalition of followers of the smaller teams who kind of come together in that sense there as well. And I'm not trying to kind of paint Celtic and Rangers fans in a bad light, so to speak, but I think they tend to be a magnet for some more of the idiots on either side of the political spectrum. In terms of the more kind of heated kind of divides within Scotland. So you do kind of get a sense of the Tartan Army are maybe a little bit more moderate and maybe a little bit more kind of, they play up to the caricature of being into their Scotland and their tartan and all those type of stereotypes. But if you speak to them, they're probably a little bit more reasoned. In terms of Scottish nationalism and its so-called civic roots, I'm sympathetic to Scottish nationalism, as you might pick up from my answers in some ways, but I think at its roots, it tries to be all things to all people. And I think they are effective at doing that. I think they are certainly very mindful of the fact that if you're ever going to get over 50%, you've got to take people who don't necessarily want to get into that kind of anti-English grievance culture. You have to kind of have a much more civic approach. And certainly the caricature of the independence movement, which came around in the kind of more unionist press, was unfair. It was kind of painting SNP members as cybernats and these kind of really kind of exclusive, ethnically kind of rooted Scottish nationalists in some ways. But there is without a doubt the core beliefs and the core appeal of the SNP does go back to some of those kind of more ethnically kind of exclusive ideas of Scottishness in that sense. And I think there is a degree of anti-Englishness within that, in that kind of sense of inferiority and that underdog mentality. But in some ways it goes back to that general sense of otherness. Scotland feels distinctive and it has a distinctive identity. And because it's got that distinctive identity separate to England as the other, I think it's easier to kind of straddle that and to kind of sanitise Scottish nationalism in a way, which I think the SNP and the Scottish Greens have done very effectively to kind of not kind of swing to the right in the way which I think when we look at UKIP and the Brexit Party and the BNP and the EDL, in some ways they've kind of played to that and they're quite willing to embrace that, whereas I think the SNP have sensibly distanced themselves from that because they're trying to basically be a party of government and quite moderate. So I think they're being disingenuous when they say there is no kind of ethnic elements to it, but in the same sense that I think it is more civic and more institutional. And I think the Tartan Army kind of represents in some ways some of the kind of less heated elements of Scottish identity and nationalism, I guess.
I think that is us done, Stuart.
Excellent.
Thank you ever so much. That was a truly fantastic conversation, really insightful. That is really kind of you. And Stuart, if anyone wants to engage with your work, how can they do that? Twitter address, for example, or academic web pages, etc.?
Yeah, so obviously, as you mentioned, I'm at Oxford Brookes, so there's Oxford Brookes website, which has links to all of my various social medias. I'm on Twitter as @Stuart Wiggum. I'm not a very active Twitterer, but I do every so often put things on, one related to kind of Scottish politics and nationalism and football, but often my beloved Hibs and our many miseries, as you mentioned before we started recording. So I'm available on Twitter for those of you who want to see dry humour and misery. That is what I purvey on a regular basis.
That's what we all want. Thanks ever so much, Stuart, and we will leave it there. Thank you, listeners. Hope you've enjoyed this, and we'll speak soon.
If you enjoyed this show, then please do head to your listening platform of choice and leave us a review. This will help new listeners to find us. We would love to hear your thoughts and questions on today's show, so please do connect with us on Twitter at FootballSocPod. Thank you for listening to the show and supporting the Football and Society podcast.